Steven Andrus here for thelines.com, playpicks.com, joined again by the Lines senior writer Mo Nawara, talking baseball metrics, analytics, advanced statistics to help you get ready to bet for baseball season from opening day throughout the postseason, looking at both handicapping individual games, futures markets as well. We've talked about some advanced stats already here on the YouTube channel. In this video, we're going to talk about wRC plus. So Mo, first question, what is it?
So wRC plus is weighted runs created plus. It's an advanced offensive metric that's trying to give you a picture of how good a given MLB offense is and player. It applies to players as well. Each player has their own wRC plus as well, but it's not super useful for handicapping on the player level. I mean, if you get a guy like Mike Trout or something who's out, that's obviously like going to move the line. But generally speaking, you know, when we handicap for baseball, we're using it on the team level.
All right, so mostly a team level stat usage here. The next question I always want to ask you is what the numbers actually stand for, the range here, right? Because it's one thing to have a stat, but if you don't know what's a good number in that stat, what's a bad number, it's useless to you. So, I mean, obviously casual baseball fans know that an ERA of 1 is good, an ERA of 9 is really bad. So with wRC plus, what's the range that we're looking here, just so that we have a basic understanding of the way the numbers for this stat work?
So the way the numbers for wRC plus work is the plus is basically that it's scaling to league average, which is 100. So every team and player has their own weighted runs created, but you know, it's a counting stat basically. It's just the more runs you create, the higher your counting stat is going to go. It's like hitting home runs. But to make it more of like a picture of talent level, they scale it to league average, where 100 is league average. So the numbers are going to be usually within 20 points of 100. So like the worst offenses will usually be around 80. The best offenses will usually be around 120. And every point, it represents 1 percentage point away from league average, either above or below. So like 105 wRC plus means they're producing offense at 5% better than the league average. And a 95 would mean they're producing 5% less than the league average. If you have a truly spectacular player, they can be close to 200 wRC plus, but league average is league average for a reason, right? That means most teams are around it. So you can get some pretty big differences. I've seen some teams like in the 70s before. I think the Rockies came to mind a year or two ago, and the occasional team offense can be close to 125, 130 in certain splits, but generally most teams are within 20% of league average.
So last season, just to further that point, number one team was the Houston Astros at 116 wRC plus. The worst team was the Colorado Rockies at an 82 wRC plus. There were 11 teams with 101 or better, and the rest were 98 or lower. So we have 30 teams in Major League Baseball. So that kind of, 14 to 18 range, we're looking at 93 to 97 on the wRC plus scale just for the 2021 season. And obviously that can change in past seasons. You guys watching can go back and look at how it's played out in years previous before 2021. So Mo, I guess my next question here is how much you weight this stat compared to the pitching metrics that you look at as well. Obviously, you mentioned this is a stat you look at a little bit more on the team side. We've been talking a lot about pitching, in particular starting pitching. So where does this kind of fall in your handicapping process with those pitching metrics?
Usually just like giving more weight to pitching. I mean, that's just the key part of baseball handicapping is the starting pitchers, right? They vary much more in talent level compared to the offenses. Like we're talking about how close these offenses are. It's kind of really giving you a picture of how flat the talent level is in Major League Baseball. And that's kind of a thing that people who have watched baseball for a long time are pretty aware of, and that's why usually most money lines are within, closer than minus 200 generally. Like it's hard to be a big favorite in baseball because most of the teams have pretty similar talent levels. So that's true of offenses, but pitching can vary wildly. I mean, they have kind of a similar stat for pitchers like ERA minus, FIP minus. These are kind of giving you the pitcher's ability relative to the league talent level. And I mean, you're going to see 50-point splits between good pitchers and bad pitchers sometimes, where that's just not going to happen with these offenses. So, major league hitters make it to the majors for a reason. They know how to hit major league pitching. And even if they stink, relatively speaking, they're like not as bad as I think a lot of people might think relative to even a very good offense like the Dodgers, for example. Like you said, Houston was only around 15% better than league average at producing runs, and they were the number one offense last year.
Yeah. I mean, and you had talked about in years previous where those, the number one team would have been a lot more than 16%, right? In years prior to this era that we're in right now.
Yeah, you can sometimes see like 122, 123, I think I've seen in the past. And I mean, you think about what that means. So like the average baseball winning score is something like 5 runs, right?
Right.
So that means if these teams are producing 20% better than league average, they're scoring
6
like
runs.
an extra run, and that's how close it is. And that's why every baseball line is basically 1.5 runs, right? I mean, your average baseball game is expected to be decided by 1 or 2 runs.
Yeah, for sure. So before we wrap up here, Mo, and I'm going to ask you what's maybe a tough question, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway. How are you using this on a daily basis throughout the season, or are you using it in spring training to look at some futures markets? Where are you finding yourself applying your wRC plus research?
So definitely just using it on a daily basis, looking at the strength of the offense. So what makes wRC plus so unbiased and great to use from a handicapping point of view is that it ignores league and park effects, and park effects can be massive. Like if you just looked at even something like weighted on base average, WOBA, it's going to massively inflate like a Rockies player. Cause it's just, they're going to get on base more. They're going to hit for more power, wRC plus adjusts for park. So that's why the Rockies look so bad, right? In wRC plus, where like they might actually be scoring a decent amount of runs.
Yeah, that was actually, I should have brought that. Yeah, I should have brought that up earlier, right? The fact it didn't dawn on me, but all the talk about it's so easy to score runs at Coors Field, the Mile High Air, and last year they were dead last in wRC plus. So that's exactly your point, right? It's taking bias out of this completely.
Yeah, and when we look at 2 teams matched up against each other, we want an unbiased, clear picture of the strength of the offenses. Not usually using it for preseason stuff for the most part. It's definitely for me more, I would say more art than science when I'm looking at these lineups, just trying to figure out the rough strengths of the lineups. But once I get into the season, I'm usually using it every game, but for the first few months, taking the numbers with a pretty big grain of salt. And then another key factor is I'm looking at the handedness splits of the offenses. There's some offenses that perform much better against left-handed or right-handed pitchers. And it's not as important as it used to be because bullpens pitch so much more of the game than they used to be, but it's still pretty important to look at how an offense is performing against a lefty or a righty. You look at a team like the Blue Jays, like almost all their hitters are right-handed. I mean, they've been terrorizing lefties the last couple of years, and they're going to get a bump against a left-handed starter, you know, and you need to know that when you're trying to estimate how each team is going to perform.
One last question I wanted to ask you here, actually. You know, once we get to like June and later in the season, and if it's June, then you have 2 months worth of sample for that season. We've talked about looking at this overall, but when, if at all, are you looking at like time splits here, looking at the past month, the past 2 weeks? I know we're getting into smaller samples in the course of the season, but you know, we've seen changes like that, right? Where maybe a team acquires a new player, or they just revert back to or they regress back to maybe what their averages were closer to the year before. So give us an idea of when and how often you're looking at splits over time for wRC plus.
I think generally not using it too much, but you did hit on a key factor there. And I think the sweet spot is like June and July, like mid-June to like late July, because there's a huge inflection point at the trading deadline where teams' offenses can significantly change, and you can't just use the team's wRC plus number as gospel anymore at that point. I guess a good example from last year would be like the Nationals, right? They traded off Schwarber.
Trey Turner too. They trade Trey Turner to the Dodgers in 2021.
Yeah. Turner and Schwarber. Yeah. It's like when these teams are selling off these major pieces, I mean, you have to mentally adjust these numbers down, you know, and by contrast, a team picks up a big bat, you have to mentally adjust it up a little bit. You know, they're going to perform better than their numbers say. And at that point, you do have to be aware of that. I've had some trouble sometimes after the deadline using these numbers too much as gospel. And you really need to remember that the teams are changing their true talent levels once they've, you know, made, especially when they move multiple players, which happens with a fairly regular basis. I mean, you look at the A's right now, they're already trading off half their team. So, you know, teams that are out of contention are going to try to reload for future seasons and sell off pieces. And it can change the way these teams are performing. I mean, we saw the Braves last year. Nobody thought this was a World Series serious contender, you know, and then they add all these bats and all of a sudden the offense is back above water. And that was huge.
And it wasn't reflected in their futures price at the time. So 100%, Mo. Appreciate it. Yeah. And for those that might be watching this down the road, we're recording this around a couple days before opening day at the start of the 2022 season. And yes, the A's are already trying to sell off pieces, and we haven't played a regular season game yet. So perhaps Moneyball 2.0 is here. So Mo, as always, appreciate the great insight. You can find Mo Noir's work at thelines.com throughout baseball season. For Mo, I'm Steven Andrus. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.